Shealy of Fairgrove, Missouri. MD, PhD, neurosurgeon, developer of TENS machines, author of 9 books, over 200 articles, hundreds of speaking engagements, and operator, founder, and director of his own clinic in Missouri, stress management, and which they specialize in depression, stress management sort of things, and other things he'll tell you about. It's called the Shealy Institute, which was rather a stroke of genius, I think. He just flew in to be with us tonight. He has a tremendously busy schedule, a tremendously big practice. He is known all over the globe and has spoken all over the globe in his work, which is far ahead of what we would know as the standard medical establishment. We're happy to have Dr. Shealy with us tonight, and we know you are too. Welcome him here with us tonight.
Thank you.
Think that'll be okay? If it isn't,
If it's not, I'll take that one. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Dean. You know, it's rare that I feel as if I'm traditional. At a meeting like this, I feel as gosh, I don't have much to say to these people. They know all the far out stuff. It reminds me of 1974. I was at the May Lectures in London at Brunel University, and we went out each night into London, a few of us, to speak to the public, about 1,200 people. And I stood up, and you know, the British sense of humor, I mean, our lack thereof occasionally. I said, the last time I spoke on this subject was in 1844. And there was not even a smile in the audience. And I was talking about my last life in London. And they never quite understood what it was all about. Hopefully tonight you may understand what I'm talking about. It may not be far out to a group like this, but I assure you that it is not likely to be presented at the American Psychiatric or Psychological Association. About 15 years ago, a rather wild and woolly engineer came to see me, as many people do when they have a new gadget to present to the world that's electrical and has to do with treating the body. And he said, this great machine is going to revolutionize TENS. It's better than the device you created. And those of you who don't know what TENS is a battery-powered electrical stimulator that is used for pain control. And I introduced the concept back in 1967, and it is literally used now throughout the world. Even in Russia, they have a few of them. And most countries produce their own. In this country alone, there are 35 to 40 companies that manufacture TENS devices, and they're even covered by medical insurance, as much as medical insurance covers anything these days, and occasionally even by Medicare when they flip the coin the right way. And he brought me this device, and I said, but I don't feel anything. And he said, you're not supposed to. And you know, I'm not much into subtle feeling. I mean, I'm a neurosurgeon by training, and I like to believe that if it is real, it can be measured, or it can be felt. And I believe that about all subtle energy, by the way. I think that someday we will find ways of technically finding anything that is there. And I said, it won't work. I don't feel anything. My patients won't like it. Take it away and bring me back one that's got more power to it. And a few months later, he met me in Chicago as I was flying home. We flew home together. And about 10:30 at night, I sat down with this new, very powerful device, and boy, could you feel it. I mean, it could almost throw you across the room. It's sort of like electrical shock therapy in a portable machine. And I just happened to put it on my head. And I said, hey, isn't that interesting? I see flashing lights. And it took me back to a point about 7 years earlier when I had been at the Neuroelectric Society meeting, which was a predecessor of far-out type meetings and looking at electrical equipment, and electro-sleep devices had just been introduced into this country. And of course, they had been in use for 25 years at that time in Russia. And there was a salesperson there trying to convince people to buy these electro-sleep devices. And so I wanted to try one, and he took a dozen people up to my room, and he put one on my head, and I'm sitting there, and I'm sort of seeing a few flashing lights, and I kept saying, but I'm not getting sleepy at all. It's making me, I'm feeling more and more alert. He said, no, you're supposed to go to sleep. And he tried to hypnotize me into sleep, and I kept saying, I'm wide awake. And after an hour and a half, he gave up. He couldn't put me to sleep. And he took it off my head, and I said, my God, I just had a feeling in my forehead as if I'd had an orgasm there. And everybody in the room bought one of the machines. And that was the beginning of my introduction to the use of electrical current at relatively low intensity for controlling sleep. And so when Saul List brought his device back, the 10 milliamp, the regular TENS devices usually put out 80, occasionally 100 milliamps. Saul's usual device, the one he brought me that I said take away, only put out a maximum of 4 milliamps, which is quite excessively adequate for what is needed. And so he brought this 10 milliamp device, and I put it on my head, and I sort of, it's an interesting feeling, and this light's flashing. And for about 45 minutes, I played with it. And about 11:30, I went to bed, fell asleep, and 3 hours later, I awoke and could not go back to sleep. And that just doesn't happen to me. I'm a sleep hound when it comes to going to bed at night and staying there. And so I finally got up after a couple of hours of being unable to sleep, and what did I just do? Did I lose my anything? Yes. I guess I shouldn't walk around so much.
That's the one that should be threaded.
This is the one, it should be threaded.
Yeah, here, let's pull it back.
Okay.
There you go.
Small electrical problems. At any rate, I stayed awake all day, and the next night slept extremely well. And a few months later, I decided to find out what was going on with this device. And I wasn't sure whether it was activating my cortisone level or my adrenaline level or possibly my serotonin level. These are all basic chemicals that have something to do with mood and alertness and sleep. And so my partner and I, Dr. James Quacco, decided that one morning we would use Saul's very high-power device on our heads, and we sat at our desks for 40 minutes, stimulating ourselves as strongly as we could tolerate the feeling, measuring everything we could measure in our blood at that time. Now, this is about 1976, and you couldn't do some of the things we can do today, but what we found was that 4 hours after stimulating with this device, my serotonin level in the blood, and I'll tell you a bit about these chemicals in a moment, was 5 times the upper limit of normal. Jim's only went up a couple of times. Now, Jim, if any of you know him, is a rather mellow, laid-back person, type B in the generic there, and I've been called a type A person. I think of myself as a B- now, but at any rate, obviously we are different chemical entities. And from that time forward, we have used Saul's device to help people go to sleep at night by using it in the morning. And we learned, and we've done thousands of measurements of chemicals now with it, and we learned that you've got to do it in the morning if you want to sleep that night. It is very similar to and considerably more powerful and effective than the Russian-type electro-sleep devices, which are rather low-intensity current. And so I decided if it affects sleep that much and it affects serotonin that much, it ought to affect depression. And I had a man who had been depressed for 18 years. I mean, seriously depressed with chronic low back pain. And I said, well, why don't you try this device and see what happens? Put it on for an hour this morning. And I walked in to see him 24 hours later, and he said, Doc, I'm going home. I feel great. I said, yeah, but we don't know what's going to happen yet. And then he insisted he was the best he had been in 20 years, and he went home back to Florida, and his wife called me 2 days later and said he was deeply depressed again. Obviously, one treatment was not enough. So from that time forward, we have used this type of electrical current to treat depression and to treat insomnia, and even sometimes it helps pain, although its effect upon pain is not as good as its effect upon sleep and upon depression, and I think it's because of the chemicals involved. About 6 years ago, we began measuring all kinds of neurochemicals because now you can measure things fairly easily that we could not measure then, such as beta endorphins, which weren't even known back in 1975. Most of you know that beta endorphins are the natural narcotics, the feel-good chemicals. If you don't have beta endorphins, you feel awful. And so we began measuring beta endorphins and serotonin. Now, serotonin is a chemical that helps transmit information from nerve cell to nerve cell. It happens to be made out of a rather interesting and well-known amino acid called tryptophan. And if you don't have adequate tryptophan in your diet, you will have a deficiency of serotonin. And 79% of the people that we see with chronic pain and or depression are deficient in serotonin. And you can't feel good and be happy or necessarily even be comfortable if you don't have enough serotonin. And we measure norepinephrine because we tried actually the whole adrenaline family, dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. And what we found is that in our patients, norepinephrine is the one that's really out of balance in a majority of people. So most of the people that we see are producing an inappropriate and usually excess amount of norepinephrine, adrenaline from your perspective, the stress reaction, the fight or flight chemical. And they're particularly producing an excess when they do something minor like stand up. You know, standing up is slightly stressful. And some people, you know, to couch potatoes, it's very stressful. But to normal individuals, in order to maintain your blood pressure when you stand up, you put out a little more adrenaline than you do when you're sitting down. But our patients who are chronically ill put out 2 or 3 times as much as a normal individual. And so we found abnormalities there. And then we began measuring melatonin. Melatonin has to do with not necessarily skin color, although it is indirectly involved in melanin in the skin. Melatonin is the chemical produced by the pineal gland. And it's interestingly made out of serotonin. It's the next step in going in the hierarchy to higher and higher, if you will, evolution in the brain of neurochemicals. Melatonin is really one of the most central control chemicals for everything else that's happening in the endocrine system and in the pituitary, etc. And we find that melatonin is often disturbed, especially people who are chronically depressed wake up in the morning and they don't get rid of their melatonin. And a high melatonin level makes you sleepy. And so if you don't wake up bright-eyed and bushy-tailed in the morning, you probably are not suppressing your melatonin adequately. And finally, just to see what the other side of the stress reaction is, adrenaline being the big one, or norepinephrine, measuring the sympathetic fight or flight response, There's the parasympathetic system, the vegetative, digestive, maintain the body, and sex-related balanced chemical, which would be acetylcholine, but it destroys so quickly in a test tube that we measure the enzyme that destroys it, because that's pretty stable, cholinesterase. And these 5 chemicals we have found now, and their ratios to one another, because it's very important to look at the relationship between norepinephrine and cholinesterase. They are opposites in our body. And it's very important to look at the relationship between serotonin and beta endorphin especially, and some of the other interrelationships of these neurochemicals. And what we have found is that 92% of people with clinically diagnosable depression have 1 to 7 abnormalities in their neurochemicals. Now that raises some extremely interesting aspects of depression. If it is associated virtually invariably, and I've not finished the story of how many abnormalities there are in depressed people yet, if it is associated virtually invariably with chemical abnormalities, is it a mental disease? Or is it a real physical illness? After all, diabetes is diagnosed because of an abnormal blood sugar. I mean, something as simple as a blood sugar makes diabetes a real disease. You know that medical insurance companies and doctors, even more than medical insurance companies, have never paid a great deal of attention to mental illnesses. Most so-called medical insurance policies, which aren't much these days and getting less every year, pay 30 to 60% in the best of policies of expenses for treatment of mental disorders, of which depression would be the biggest, the most common, the most prevalent such illness. But if it's associated with a physical abnormality such as a chemical disturbance, it's no longer mental as far as I'm concerned. It is now a physical disorder, and I think there should be some very interesting lawsuits against insurance companies to sue them if they don't pay for it as a real disease. Interestingly, one insurance company that I've talked with told me that if I could prove the patient had that kind of disorder, they would consider it a physical disorder. I think this is an extremely important concept for people who wind up with this problem, although you're going to have to fight battles with insurance companies to get there. And so we had this kind of background of work in the field of depression because the single most common illness, bar none, that affects human beings is depression. There are more people depressed in a given year than any other thing. Depression varies a lot, it comes and goes, but many, many people suffer bouts of depression, temporary or very prolonged. A minimum of 20% of the people who go to see a physician go there primarily because of depression. Many people have lots of other symptoms and don't even recognize or want to admit that depression is the big reason they're there. You know, it's a lot easier to say my back hurts than that I'm depressed, because depression is considered by the public to some extent also to be a mental or emotional disorder. I really consider it to be just another illness, just like a peptic ulcer or diabetes or cancer or asthma. It is one disorder affecting human beings. And then about 2 years ago, I got a letter from this brilliant, intuitive genius who created hydraulic brakes and hydraulic steering and has 88 patents in the field of hydraulics. A very shy, interesting man who is interested in consciousness. And I got a letter from him and he said, "Dear Norm, if you will study whether or not crystals can help healing, I'll give you $150,000 to do it." Now, I never thought about crystals before, to be quite honest. It had no meaning to me. I thought crystals were pretty to look at. I never had a pet crystal before. But, you know, like I said, I'll study anything practically if it's reasonable. And so I spent 7 months trying to figure out how can I study crystals and healing in a way that might produce some kind of result that's meaningful. Because you've got to worry about placebo. You know? I mean, if you believe something's going to work, it probably will have some effect upon you. And interestingly, we had the lowest placebo response in this study that I've ever had, anything I've ever done. And what we came up with is the thought that quartz crystal being piezoelectric. Do you know what piezoelectric means? Well, basically, it means if you hit it with a physical force, the physical force is transformed into electricity. Guess what structure in the human body is piezoelectric? Not the brain. Hit it with a hammer and you might not make it. Bone. Bone. Your whole skeleton is piezoelectric. Well, yeah, hit it. Not the brain, the head. You got it. And so I reasoned that quartz is used in computers and all kinds of modern electronic equipment. It can receive electrical energy. It's sort of like a radio station receiving. It can transmit, as in a quartz crystal radio, although that wasn't really the crystal used in most quartz crystal radios. And it can store electrical energy. And the mind is theoretically, by my concept, an electromagnetic machine. And so maybe if you program a quartz crystal, it will serve as a battery to give you back what you've put into it. And we decided that we knew a lot of things that would help depression already, namely Saul Liss's stimulator transcranially. We had done a study on it, comparing it with nothing, and we found that 40-some-odd% of people, just given this stimulator to use with no other treatment for 2 weeks, came out of depression. That's not bad. You know what the average antidepressant drug's response rate is? Like Elavil, one of the, until the last year at least, the most popular antidepressant drug in the country? Well, somewhere between 37 and 39% of people with depression respond to Elavil. And that's been true of almost all of the antidepressant drugs. And so we were getting at least as good an effect as Elavil with Saul's device alone. And I was aware of the work of a man in Mexico City named Alvarez Bulla, who was a neurophysiologist who was trained in Pavlovian conditioning type research. Alvarez Bulla's research that intrigued me back in the 60s was that he took dogs in a laboratory setting and gave them intravenously shots of insulin and rang a bell just after the insulin was given. 5 days, just 5 times. Once a day for 5 days, a shot of insulin plus the ringing of a bell. Now, the shot of insulin, of course, made the blood sugar go down. Week 2, he brought the dogs back, set them up in the same way, and just rang the bell. And guess what happened? The blood sugar dropped just as much as if they'd had a shot of insulin. The dog didn't even know what insulin was. And if you left those dogs for 6 months and brought them back in and rang the bell, the blood sugar still dropped. That is a conditioned response. And how many bells have been rung in our lives, each of us? Have we been conditioned to respond to words, thoughts, colors? Kay Ortmans, many of you probably know Kay, has told a tale of a woman who would go violently upset on seeing yellow. because of something that happened to her with the color yellow when she was a child. And so I reasoned that it is entirely possible to condition people to respond in a specific way. And so we created a research proposal, which was funded, to treat individuals, two main categories of individuals, those with chronic back pain, which is one of the types of problems we see most frequently, and those with depression without chronic back pain. And we brought them into our clinic for 40 hours of training. They received 10 hours of lectures about life and metaphysics and stress and that kind of thing. We talked about the chakras, and I want to talk a moment about that from a physiological point of view, because I believe the chakras are very real. I've always believed in the chakras since I first heard about them many years ago, because if you look at a picture of the chakras, it looks like a schematic drawing of the autonomic nervous system. Irving Kaur, one of the great neurophysiologists in this country, has drawn sketches of the autonomic nervous system. You open one of his papers and you think you're reading something from India about chakras. I mean, that's what it looks like. And so we teach people these principles, and we talk about the electrical and electromagnetic continuity of life with atoms, because to me that is the way it is. I mean, even this plastic on which I'm standing, somewhere inside's got some electricity going, because those little atoms are running around, electrons at least, are running around in the nucleus. And we talk about the fact that the connection between the inorganic atoms in the soil and life is actually plants. We cannot convert calcium out of the earth into living tissue. Plants can. Plants transmute inorganic into organic, organic being that associated with life. And animals, and people are animals, eat plants to survive. We cannot survive without them. And so we try to get people to understand this connection. Although there is an electrical current and activity going on in inorganic materials such as the wood here, we can't use it generally until it gets into an organic form in our bodies. And I want people just to sort of begin to see that continuity into interrelationship of everything and the electromagnetic connections. And we would show them on the first day, for instance, an old violet ray. How many of you have ever seen a violet ray? You know what it is? It's a Tesla coil, basically, that has associated with it a glass electrode that, at least in its early days, was supposed to have the rare gas argon in it. And it puts out a violet-colored, high-intensity electrical current, which Edgar Cayce used to say was good for a number of problems, including baldness, and would help grow hair back on your head. And if you touch a violet ray device, or a person who is touching a violet ray device, and you can move this down 2 or 3 people and hold in your other hand a fluorescent light bulb, it lights up. And that's kind of impressive looking, to see somebody holding a fluorescent light up here, shining light out, and not have any electricity connected to it directly. And I try to get people to understand this interconnection of electricity and electromagnetism and our connections one with another, and to demonstrate the effect of touching the human body with an electromagnetic generator and how it changes the output from electronic equipment. And so we put on these little things to try to just get people to be aware of electromagnetism. And we give them then 10 hours of this kind of lecture and 30 hours of music. And we chose to use music for a number of reasons. There is some excellent evidence in Europe that learning is accelerated in the presence of music, that students learn much better and retain information much better if there's music in the background while the teaching is going on. And furthermore, there's excellent evidence that music, to me, is the language of the soul. And so we chose to use music as a conditioning tool to help people relax and get into a state in which they're programming healing. I realize this is rather tedious, but this is what we did. I want you to understand that we didn't give them a tape player and send them home. In fact, we had 3 marvelous musical vibrating beds, one of which today is now selling for $43,000. I thought it was bad when it was $26,000. The Baytar, and it is marvelous. It's got this sort of bed that hangs down in space by chains from a geodesic dome with 20 speakers in the room. It looks like a little radio transmitting station, and your whole body vibrates with the music, to say the least. The sound is wonderful, the vibration is excellent, and it's enough to put almost anybody in a trance. And so each person got 10 sessions of music on a vibrating bed, plus another 20 hours of the same kind of music in a room that we created specially several years ago for its sound effects, where we put crushed quartz crystal under the carpet, and where in all the places there's plaster, there's crushed quartz crystal. The whole building has been energized with quartz crystal. And if you're standing in the middle of this room with these marvelous speakers going, you actually can feel the music coming up through your feet. And so the other 20 hours were in this room, which is sort of a big sound chamber too. And then they were given either glass or quartz. And they were told, of course, that it would be a double-blind study. Nobody would know who was getting what. It would be arbitrarily assigned. And they had to agree that they might not be getting an active crystal if a crystal could do anything other than what glass could do. And we chose specially carved quartz that was made so symmetrical that you couldn't distinguish it from glass. And we treated some 17 groups of people, 202 people altogether. And in 3 of the groups, just to satisfy my curiosity, I just took out 2 hands full of one of glass and one of quartz and mixed them up. Nobody knew which was which. And I asked people to choose their own. It was quite interesting to me. Half the people chose glass. They didn't know the difference. And half roughly chose quartz. So they couldn't tell whether they were getting quartz or glass. But I could tell in that situation. And other than that, a blind number was drawn and they were just assigned glass or quartz, and they were told to program it the way American Indians talk about programming crystals, some of them, those who talk about such things. Mainly and we did this in a little ceremony when they got their crystal, of passing the crystal through a candle flame and mentally releasing any stored electromagnetic energy in the crystal. And then programming what they wanted into the crystal. And we spent a lot of time with each individual getting them to focus on what they wanted. It had to be short, not more than 6 words. It had to have a high emotional meaning to them and an image that they could build with it. And so what we wanted them to do was to program into the crystal what they specifically emotionally needed for healing. And then they would create the image and the words in their minds and will it and blow out into the crystal 3 times in a row. And then the crystal was worn in a white satin, bridal satin pouch around the neck. They were to reprogram the crystal every morning for 2 weeks minimum and once a week throughout the project. We chose 8 pieces of music. Obviously, we could have left the music open, but arbitrarily I decided that we would restrict the music to 4 classical pieces and 4 New Age pieces. And I chose those that I like. I mean, you know, you got to choose. I mean, after all, there are 100. I mean, we've got several hundred compact discs, and that's just the, you know, a minimum of what one could get. And so I chose these pieces because these are the pieces of music that I have found in working with myself with music to be most helpful in helping me have insights or to create images of past lives or whatever the case may be. Mozart's Requiem. Mozart's Requiem to me is one of the greatest pieces of music for inspiration. Rachmaninoff's Isle of the Dead, which should to me be called Isle of the Living, it is a powerful piece of music. It is transcendent. For some people who are deeply depressed, it makes their depression worse. So we let each person hear each of these pieces of music once or twice and choose one classical and one New Age piece for their conditioning music. Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, because I think it's powerful and energizing. And for those people who don't like classical music, Pachelbel's Canon in D. Well, it is Pachelbel's Canon in D sounds almost like Lawrence Welk or something. I love Pachelbel's Canon, mind you, but it's been popularized enough in this country that even people who don't like classical music may be willing to choose Pachelbel's Canon for a classical piece if they are forced to do so. And then the New Age pieces that we chose were Stephen Halpern's Spectrum Suite, which is specifically intuitively created as music to balance the chakras. Another piece created exactly the same, for the same purpose, called Crystal Illumination. I couldn't resist. One of the Golden Voyage. We chose Golden Voyage 4. I like all the Golden Voyage series. And Kataro's My Best. And each person then had multiple experiences with their choice of music on the music bed, in the music room, and when they finished the project, the 2 weeks, half days, 4 hours a day for 2 weeks of instruction and experience at the clinic, they were given to take home 3 tapes. Each, they got their choice of the classical music, their choice of the New Age music, and in the background of that, they had a subliminal, my voice, guided chakra balancing exercise. And they also got the chakra balancing exercise on a tape just with the voice. I call it rainbow energy balancing. They had agreed to program their crystal and to use the tapes a minimum of 20 minutes twice a day. That's all. 20 minutes twice a day for a minimum of 3 months. That was the agreement when we started the research project. I don't think I tried. I was neutral. I really did not believe. I had no faith that crystals would be any better than glass. I knew that music conditioning and electrical stimulation transcranial, which they got every morning while they were at the clinic, just 10 days of that. I knew those things had to be good for people, but I didn't know whether crystals were any better than glass. And so I think I was as neutral as a person can be in not trying to convince people that they ought to respond to their crystal. But I said, you know, what do you got to lose? You use it as a battery transmitter to give you this phrase and image electromagnetically 24 hours a day that you've created to help you heal. And we talk about the fact that It's very important to keep a positive attitude, because negative attitudes are infinitely more powerful in their effect upon your body than positive ones are. And we've done this with hundreds of people, and there's just no question. If you think about the worst thing that ever happened to you, you feel much more intensely than the best thing that ever happened to you. It's more painful, it's more alarming. And so I estimate that at the very least, negative thinking is twice as powerful as positive thinking in its effect upon your body. That's just the minimum. And so if you are spending 10% of your day in a negative mood or mode, you already have used up 20% of your available energy. And now you're going to be down to a C grade at the very best. And if you spend 25% of your time in a negative mode, that's 50% of your total reserves you've used up. And that's a flunk. And it's impossible to get well if you spend 25% of your time in a negative mode. And so if you watch the news or listen to the news or read the newspapers, you've already used up your daily quota of 10%. And so you need something positive to keep giving you that reinforcement. And so we use this as an allegory for how they should view the crystal. Interestingly, 85% of the people believed, they said in questionnaires, that they were getting a real quartz crystal, even though they knew that only 50% of them were going to get the real stuff. 85% said they thought they got a real crystal. And there were just as many who got quartz who thought they did not as who got glass who thought that they did not. So it was pretty well distributed that way. The results, I'm going to refer to my notes so I don't make any mistakes about it, because the results were shocking to me. I still have some, if I didn't know that I had nothing to do with the accumulation of the results. This was all done by other people on my staff. They just kept all the data, and I finally said, okay, now let's look at what we've got. A minimum of 3 months after the last patient went through the treatment program, and we had the follow-ups for 3 months. Remember, they only got 2 weeks, half days of treatment, 40 hours. And so 3 months later, we measured them again, and we had tests of chemistries in their blood as well as the written tests that tell you whether somebody's depressed. Here are the statistics. Interestingly, because the depressed people and those with back pain were mixed in the same room, and we didn't do a separate double-blind distribution of glass and quartz to depressed people versus those with back pain, the depressed people got more quartz than their fair share. 88 out of 141 depressed people got quartz, and only 54 got glass. Of those who got quartz, 70% were still free of their depression 3 months later. That's phenomenal odds. There is no drug in the world that can come close to giving you a 70% success rate in treating depression. Those who got glass were hardly a placebo, only 31%, less than half as many. And yet, when we did the statistical analysis, even that was highly statistically significant. In other words, if you look at the changes in their scores, the conditioning program and the electrical stimulation all in itself helped some people with depression. But adding the quartz crystal was phenomenally better. I still have trouble believing it, but it's what we got. And there's a part of me that believes it. It's the facts. The back pain people, and these are all people with very significant back pain problems, 55% of those who got quartz were markedly improved in their pain. Only 23% of those who got glass were markedly improved in their pain. I mean, that's below placebo. That's negative placebo response. Even that was statistically significant at about the 95th percentile. You know how statistics are. You can do anything with them. But the real difference was the quartz crystal compared to everything else. The chances of this happening by chance are less than 1 in 10,000. That's not bad. I don't think that electric shock therapy can come close to giving you that kind of results in the treatment of depression. So the question of can quartz or crystal and music heal is unquestionable in my mind. Yes, they can help back pain and they can help depression. We tried to get 50 patients with severe coronary artery disease. We could not. We got 13. And the reason was that an intuitive friend of mine, Carolyn Mace, with whom I have worked for a number of years and who co-authored 2 books with me, I asked, as I was planning this crystal research project, I said, how do we measure scientifically the effects of crystals upon healing? And she says, and I quote, if you would place crushed sapphire over the heart, within 3 weeks you could bypass the need for bypass surgery. That's a pretty strong statement. That's provable. Unfortunately, I couldn't get any doctors to give me any patients to try at no charge this treatment on. But we were able to work with some people who had moderate heart disease, and all of them did well. They improved symptomatically. But it's not a big enough statistical study to make anything out of. We had people who had cholesterol that came down to normal, irregular heartbeats that reverted to normal. And so it may be worth pursuing if you could get a cardiologist or an internist to be willing to try it in patients who aren't candidates for other approaches, perhaps. There's no question in my mind that it appears that for reasons that I can't explain, the theory is there, maybe this begins to provide evidence that it works, but that crystal and music can be used as enhancers of healing. Now I want to talk just a few moments about some of the accessories that were part of this program because I think they are an important part of it. I would not like to just give somebody a quartz crystal and a music tape and tell them to go home and heal themselves. I don't think that's quite strong enough. Maybe it is. This is one model of this electrical stimulator that Saul Liss makes that I talked about. Usually it comes with wires that go up and you put the electrodes on in a headband. He's made this one more recently, so it actually is all in one piece. And all you do with this is put these little sponges that are wet in water on your temples or red on head, black in back, and stimulate across the head at 1 milliamp of current, 1,000th of an amp of current, which you do not feel, but which is powerful in its effect upon your neurochemicals. And I want to talk just for a moment about the neurochemical balancing that takes place with all these things that we're talking about. And so the Liss cranial stimulator is a useful adjunct in helping people to sleep, in helping depression, sometimes in treating pain, and it's phenomenal for jet lag. It will reset your serotonin, melatonin diurnal pattern. You know, we have these patterns where we go up and down at certain times of day, and that's what happens to a lot of people when they're out of sync time-wise. I have used this many times in traveling across the ocean in all directions, and if you use this at 9 o'clock in the morning of the time where you're going to land, it virtually prevents jet lag. I took it to a meeting in Honolulu a year and a half ago, and I got there late at night, and I arrived and went to the meeting at 8 o'clock the next morning feeling great. 11 other people on the board were sitting there sort of half asleep. They hadn't recovered at all, and I hadn't taken this to the meeting with me, and so the next day I took my little stimulator down to the board meeting, and everybody set their pad. They were still suffering jet lag, and I was feeling fine, and everybody had just one treatment with it, and that was the end of their jet lag. It is a powerful regulator of neurochemicals, and I'll tell you in a moment about some of the special studies we've done with this alone. Secondly, for the last 15 years, we've also worked with what I call brain synchronization, using flashing lights to stimulate the brain to follow a certain rhythm. This has been known since the 1920s when EEGs, electroencephalograms, were discovered, that the brain will follow any rhythm that's put into it. If you flash lights or give sound to a person at 7 or 8 or 9 or 30 cycles per second, the brain will follow that. It increases the alpha if you're using an alpha frequency. It increases the beta or the theta or the delta, which have specific helps. Alpha rhythm is a relaxing rhythm, and theta rhythm is not only relaxing but also assists most people in creative visualization, in daydreaming, in intuitive development, etc. And the origin of brain synchronization, as far as I know, goes to Carl Snyder of the Chicago area, who discovered during World War II that people who were watching radar screens became hypnotized by them. And he reasoned that if you then were to put a flashing light in front of somebody, it ought to help them go into a hypnotic trance. And he created and started selling in the 50s something called the Snyder Brain Synchronizer, and it was sold to people for hypnosis. And his was a single box about this big with a great big vacuum tube type light in it, and it works. And there were articles published in the JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, about it as early as 1960, stating that it was a very useful adjunct for anesthesia and for obstetrics and for putting people into hypnosis. And so we've played with different types of machinery, and this is the model that we've made, which we call the Shealy RelaxMate, and this is the one we use, and I'll just show you. It has a number of controls. There's a red light with a little blue halo around it that helps give it a more mellow color than red, because these are LED lights. It has a timer that you can use 15, 30, or 60 minutes, and it's self-adjustable, which is extremely important, easily to go from 3 hertz, or 3 cycles, to 12 cycles. 12 is the upper limit that I like to use for alpha, and 3.1 really is just above delta. And as Carl Snyder found, it's extremely important to let the patient choose the frequency. You don't want a fixed frequency. You can put 80% of people into a deep state of relaxation within 5 minutes if they choose their own frequency. And within 10 minutes, at least 90% of people will be in a deep state of relaxation without doing anything but watching these lights. And so these were a part of what they did every day, as well as the electrical stimulator, as well as the music, as well as the mental programming. I mean, it's very complicated, and it would take years to try to decide whether any one thing that we did is more essential than the others, and in a sense, I don't care as long as it works. That is, I don't have to know whether they could get by just with these. I do know this is good for relaxation. But we have studied the neurochemical effects of some of these individual treatments. We've done a whole batch of studies on those, and I want to share with you what happens. And we've even done spinal taps on ourselves, my partner and I and 3 other volunteers. I mean, I won't do that on patients, because that does carry a potential slight risk, but we felt it was important enough to measure these chemicals in our cerebrospinal fluid to compare them with those in the blood. And what we found is that beta endorphin and melatonin and serotonin are at least as good in the blood as they are in the cerebrospinal fluid for telling you what's happening. In other words, the relationships between them, the way in which they change with various things we do, is very similar in blood and cerebrospinal fluid. Actually, the blood is better than the cerebrospinal fluid for cholinesterase and norepinephrine. You don't get much of any change in the cerebrospinal fluid in the stress chemicals. Interestingly, they are a peripheral thing. The list stimulator is one of the most powerful techniques we've seen for raising beta endorphin, for lowering melatonin, which is desirable in the morning, and for increasing serotonin. It really normalizes those neurochemicals. The brain synchronizer, at least the one we've used, I know nothing, there are lots of models of them these days, the ones we've used are almost as effective as the electrical stimulator in a given person for raising the beta endorphin, decreasing the melatonin, and slightly increasing the serotonin. Music. The music beds, lying on those, primarily have an effect on increasing beta endorphins, the feel-good chemicals. They have very little effect on the other neurochemicals, perhaps some slight decrease in norepinephrine. Jogging. Jogging 30 minutes at a very slow pace, a 12-minute mile, 2.5 miles in 30 minutes. It's a fairly slow jog, has a marked effect of increasing beta endorphin, decreasing melatonin, increasing serotonin, slightly increasing norepinephrine, temporarily, which you would expect. So jogging and music and this individually do affect the neurochemicals. So we could say that, you know, they probably are additive. We don't unequivocally know that yet. Finally, massage. Receiving massage. Just 30 minutes. We tried to keep everything consistent for, 30 minutes of music, 30 minutes of this, 30 minutes of this, separate times. Receiving a 30-minute total body massage has a phenomenally good effect upon beta endorphins especially. Does not decrease melatonin as much, which would be expected because actually that puts you into a deeper state of being almost ready to go to sleep. But it does increase the feel-good chemicals. Interestingly, it does not change the neurochemicals in the person giving the massage. I was rather surprised at that. I thought that the person giving the massage would have some change in neurochemicals, but they did not. We did yoga for 30 minutes. I was somewhat surprised that there was no effect in the chemicals we measured of yoga upon the neurochemicals. We watched a porno movie. No effect. We had people masturbate privately for 30 minutes. No effect on neurochemicals. If you add together the music, the electrical stimulator, and the brain synchronizer in given volunteers and measure the neurochemicals, of course, you get the most powerful effect of all. Those are three things you can do all at the same time. You can't quite jog and do this and all that at the same time. But those three, we know, are additive. So there is some sort of supportive circumstantial evidence that using the combination of therapies may be more effective than using any one of them alone. The bottom line is that, and to me the good news is certainly that there are very effective techniques for treating depression, the most prevalent problem in America and probably in the world today. And I'm going to take my last few minutes to take questions from you. Incidentally, those who are interested, I brought a number of brochures of the things we do, a newsletter that we print that's far out stuff about new techniques of healing from mostly physicians and psychologists and health professionals who are trying unique things long before they make it into general circulation. Whole host practice reports there. There's something here called the personal stress assessment, which is a little test we use to help people understand how much stress they've got in life. So if you want any information like that, it's right over here. If you have any questions related to music and crystals and healing, this is the time. Okay. Okay, what kind of music? We chose one of 4 classical pieces. Each person chose, Catarro's my best. I gave those, one of those, one New Age, one classical piece. Yes?
What was the stone again that was crushed over the heart?
Sapphire.
Does it have to be crushed?
Yes. You want to? What was the stone used over the heart? It was sapphire. Does it have to be crushed? Yes. Blue sapphire. Yes. Because it increases the surface area.
Oh, so could you use a number?
Well, I guess you could use a dozen small sapphires, yes. Or big ones if you really are flush.
The chemical is deficient in Parkinson's. Would that increase it?
Dopamine. We did not measure dopamine in this particular study because in our original studies on pain and depression before this, we had found almost no changes in dopamine in that particular subgroup of people. We haven't looked at it in Parkinsonian patients. Dopamine, of course, is a precursor of norepinephrine, so theoretically it ought to be increased somehow if norepinephrine can be changed. Yes?
How were the crystals actually used? Did they carry them on their person?
They wore them in a white satin pouch around the neck.
And for 24 hours a day?
Well, we told them they could take them off at night, but they were to put them beside their bed and let no one else touch them. Yes?
Have you ever considered?
I cannot answer the question about chromium in the blood because we haven't measured it. Magnesium, I forgot to talk about. Magnesium, 80% of the people we have tested who have chronic depression are highly deficient in magnesium. But we were not replacing magnesium in this study. We are playing with replacing magnesium now. You know what magnesium means, by the way, is magnetism, interestingly. It's a highly magnetic chemical, and it is intimately related with calcium in the bone structure, which is why bone is piezoelectric. Yes?
Have you considered doing a test of either body chemistry or neurochemistry with someone doing 30 minutes of, say, something like hatred or anger to see what happens with chemistry?
Have we measured or thought about measuring the blood, the neurochemistry, et cetera, in people who are experiencing 30 minutes of anger or hatred? We've thought about it. We just haven't done it yet. It takes money to do those kinds of experiments, and we didn't have an endowment to do that. Yes?
What happens to the chemicals of the body when it's fast jogging?
What happens to the chemicals of the body when it's fast jogging? Well, we know that your norepinephrine goes up even more during it, but over a 24-hour period, people who jog a lot actually run lower base levels of norepinephrine. It markedly increases the beta endorphins and decreases the melatonin. Yes?
Since over 90% of the American public has mercury dental work, did you do any studies with the chemical imbalances caused by that?
Since 90% of Americans have mercury leaching out of their dental cavities that have been filled with 60% or 50% mercury mixed with silver, did we do any studies of that? No. I'm well aware of that. We do look at that occasionally, but not in this particular study. Yes?
Did any of the people that were depressed have a learning disability or dyslexia?
Did any of the...
And would this type of treatment help them?
Okay, I can't answer the question because I don't know. None of the people in our study had dyslexia or known learning deficiency or learning disability problems. Would this type of treatment help that? I don't know. I do know that using this stimulator does increase memory temporarily, and it helps spasticity. And we use it all the time in children with cerebral palsy. for about an hour after using this, spasticity is significantly reduced. Yes?
Is there any correlation done between people with depression and perhaps alcoholic parents or grandparents?
Any correlation between people with depression and alcoholic parents or grandparents? There is an increased incidence of a number of things in people who are chronically depressed: sexual abuse, physical abuse as children, alcoholism in their family. Yes, there is an increased incidence. It's not everybody by any means, but there's more than you would find in another group of patients who are not depressed. Yes.
I wonder if when you use a stimulator, a light flash on the eyes, if you do not produce or trick the eye into producing visual purple.
Okay, the question is, when you're stimulating the eye with this, or even tricking it with the electrically induced flicker response, are you increasing the production of visual purple? I don't know.
Because, see, the visual purple itself, when it breaks down, has a fantastic effect.
Right, because visual purple breaking down has a fantastic effect. Yes, there are lots of studies I would love to do on this. We just haven't done. But if you look at the fact that 80% of people are deficient in magnesium, and 92% have some neurochemical abnormality, and over 50% have some amino acid deficiency, we can now say that at least 99% of people with depression have some chemical abnormality, and I think someday we'll find it in that other 1%. Yes?
Have you heard anything about the research? I know it's been done, and that is that jet lag is not what people commonly believe it to be, but rather a preponderance of positive ions.
Yeah, some people, the question is, am I aware of the fact that there's some evidence that jet lag is the result of excessive positive ions? Well, there are a number of things that contribute to jet lag, including anoxia, having inadequate oxygen for 6 hours when you go across the ocean, and that kind of thing that certainly contribute to jet lag. I think the primary effect of jet lag, personally, is crossing all those electrogeomagnetic lines and time zone changes. But it can be. But the nice thing about it is this does prevent it. Yes.
Does the brain synchronizer have the same effect on jet lag as?
I can't. The question is, does the brain synchronizer have the same effect on jet lag? I don't know. I suspect it will help. We're going to find out in the next 6 months whether it does, because that's a lot easier, and most people would be more. Well, this is a prescription item, by the way. Oh, these little things are like $600 or $700. These are over-the-counter items, and they are going to be sold on national television by sometime late this fall on one of those telecommercial things with 4 cassette tapes for $99. Yes?
Did you bring a lot of script?
A lot of script? Oh, no, I can't write a prescription in Colorado. I'm from Missouri. Yes.
Have you worked with any other stones besides quartz crystal and sapphire?
Oh, I was afraid that was going to come up. Have I worked with any other stones besides quartz crystal and sapphire? Yes and no. I've played with them. I have not worked with them. Working to me means doing specific research.
Do you have any insights that you'd like to share with us?
Well, again, Carolyn, who is one of my consultants in all these metaphysical things, says that there are stones, and they pretty well fall into the general concept of what most metaphysical people think, although there are some ones that she's perhaps a little different on. She, for instance, thinks that each chakra has certain stones that are particularly helpful for it. Sapphire happens to be the most powerful for the heart, but tourmaline, watermelon tourmaline, she also uses for the heart, and rose quartz, of course, which almost everybody does. And either sapphire or lapis for the throat chakra. And I'll never forget when she came up with 2 stones that she was talking about, and I thought she had made them up. I mean, she talked about celestite, and I said, come on now, as being for spiritual stuff. I mean, celestite, but it exists, it's real. I'm not a geologist. And then she came up with one called Herkimer. And I said, huh? spell it. And I went to the encyclopedia and I could not find Herkimer. I said, I caught her. She made that one up. Well, actually, it's called the Herkimer diamond. And it is in the encyclopedia if you look under diamonds. It's not a diamond. It's a special kind of quartz crystal that has a little inclusion body, and it's found in Herkimer, New York. She thinks that Herkimers and celestite and amethyst are the best for spiritual work, etc. Yes? Yes?
You mentioned magnesium, you mentioned bones.
Yes.
Is there correlation, in your opinion, between the chemicals in the brain and osteoporosis?
Is there a correlation between the chemicals in the brain and osteoporosis? Yes, unequivocally. And also magnesium deficiency, I think, is maybe more important than calcium deficiency in producing osteoporosis and osteoarthritis, I believe. And muscle pain, and inability to sleep. All of these things are markedly influenced by deficiencies in magnesium. I think I better quit. I'll be happy. I'm going to be here through Sunday. I'll be happy to take your questions separately, but I don't want to hog the time beyond what I was given. Thank you very much.